In early 2025, Cambodia blocked a regional agreement its allies wanted. Maldives signed 20 binding deals with Beijing. Ecuador suddenly dropped its Taiwan deal. No threats, no invasion. Just 3 quiet weeks that reshaped the balance of power. And I'm David, and this is where it gets calculated. These weren't random moves. Cambodia's block of the ASEAN Communique followed months of intensive discussions in Beijing. Maldives had been negotiating since late 2024. Ecuador's timing coincided with a Chinese trade delegation through Latin America. What binds them is subtler than invasion or ultimatum. It's how Beijing prefers to operate. No public demand, no humiliation, just the economics making one choice, obviously better than the other. The pattern repeated across 2 continents. In Southeast Asia, nations that depend on Beijing for infrastructure investment quietly aligned with Beijing's foreign policy. In Latin America, a smaller economy made a deal that cost it Taiwan but gave it market access it desperately needed. No dramatic reversals, just slow drift. When a country quietly bows to Beijing instead of the West, it changes which companies win contracts, which currency flows in and out, which nations get military equipment. It shapes your phone supply chain, your food costs, whether regional conflicts stay frozen or boil over. But to understand how Beijing turned small concessions into structural control, we need to look back 2,000 years. For 2 millennia, Beijing had a system that achieved exactly this. Imperial China's tributary system extracted deference without conquest. Smaller states gave tribute, treasure, envoys, ceremonial gestures, and in exchange Beijing offered military protection and preferential trade. The hierarchy was absolute, but the cost was minimal. No garrisons to maintain, no rebellions to suppress, just annual ceremonies where smaller powers acknowledged the center's supremacy. The system broke down when sea trade bypassed the Silk Road and Beijing lost economic leverage. But the logic never died. In the 2000s and 2010s, as Chinese capital accumulated and US manufacturing moved east, Beijing began reconstructing the exact same architecture, not through tributary envoys, but through infrastructure loans and trade agreements. The parallel is sharp. Ancient tributary states perform deference for security and trade access. Modern debtor states perform compliance for infrastructure investment and market entry. Neither system relies on conquest. Both work because the smaller power decides that staying inside the hierarchy is cheaper than trying to leave it. That infrastructure is the lock. Laos borrowed heavily from Beijing to build a high-speed rail line that was supposed to move goods from Bangkok to Kunming, unlocking trade and growth. It was built. It barely breaks even. Laos's foreign debt stabilized at $19.3 billion in 2024. That's the entire country's annual economic output, with China as its biggest creditor and the repayment schedule eating half the government's annual revenue. This happened by design, not accident. Cambodia borrows from Chinese state banks more than from the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and every other multilateral lender combined. Every time it needs capital, Beijing is the fastest, easiest option, and Beijing makes sure of it. The result, Cambodia is locked into Beijing's economic orbit. Djibouti, a tiny port nation in the Horn of Africa, is the clearest cautionary tale. China invested $14 billion in Djiboutian infrastructure between 2012 and 2020. The country couldn't service the debt. In December 2022, Djibouti suspended payments entirely. It took over a year to negotiate even a preliminary moratorium. The infrastructure was supposed to create returns that would pay for itself. Instead, it created dependence that Beijing weaponizes at will. But debt alone doesn't enforce the hierarchy. Beijing also carries a coercion toolkit. Watch the timeline. Wine sanctions lasted 4 years, barley restrictions held for 3. But in April 2025, Beijing cut rare earth exports in response to U.S. tariffs. And within 6 weeks, Ford had shut down U.S. manufacturing for lack of components. No announcement, no negotiation, just economic facts that made one choice obvious. The pattern is identical. Whether the target is Japan, Australia, or America, Beijing doesn't announce the pressure, it deploys it quietly, and the economic pain forces compliance. The scale of this system becomes clear when you look at where it's concentrated. See Kyrgyzstan, 39% of its external debt is owed to China. That's not a creditor relationship, that's structural control. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the other Central Asian republics walk a strategic tightrope. Russia provides military security, China provides capital and trade access. Each nation is deeply indebted to Beijing. The same pattern repeats across Pacific Island nations, African capitals, and Gulf monarchies. Position geography, Chinese capital, and borrowed time in a hierarchy that looks voluntary because the alternative is economically ruinous. This is why Beijing chooses the tributary model over outright occupation. An occupied territory bleeds a conqueror's resources. You need troops to hold it, administrators to manage it, money to rebuild it. If people resist, you need more troops. If the economy doesn't grow, the occupation becomes a perpetual subsidy. The Soviet Union learned this in Afghanistan. America learned it in Iraq. Occupation is expensive, fragile, and politically toxic at home. A tributary state that self-censors out of economic necessity is infinitely more valuable. It willingly defers without costing you a soldier. Its leaders make Beijing's decisions because refusing means bankruptcy. Not because Beijing forced them, but because their own survival depends on it. That is the elegant brutality of the system. Conquest requires permanent force. Tributaries require only the occasional reminder that the capital flow can stop. The system works as long as Beijing has capital to deploy and growth to sustain. But the moment China's economy slows or capital dries up, every debtor nation becomes desperate to diversify away from Beijing. The entire structure depends on permanent Chinese economic dominance. Which is why the West is fighting the wrong battle. Washington and Brussels see Beijing as a trade competitor, so they're raising tariffs, subsidizing domestic semiconductors, and trying to decouple their supply chains from China. That's fighting a market battle. Beijing is building a hierarchy of deference, where smaller nations choose compliance to survive. That's fighting a power battle. The two strategies are not even in the same conflict. When America tariffs Chinese steel, it thinks it's protecting American jobs. Beijing doesn't care about the tariff. It cares about the 14 countries that buy Chinese steel because they're locked into infrastructure deals that require it. The US sees trade. Beijing sees political control. Kyrgyzstan doesn't buy rare earths because it wants to. It buys them because 40% of its external debt is owed to China, and Beijing makes clear that accessing Chinese capital depends on alignment. When the US sanctioned Russian oil, it took months to create economic pressure. When Beijing cuts rare earth exports, it works in weeks because the leverage runs through debt, not trade competition. But this system isn't unbreakable. There are 3 limits where this system hits a wall. First, Taiwan. Taiwan's sovereignty is non-negotiable for both Beijing and Washington. Beijing can't tributary a democratic nation that refuses, and Washington won't allow China to absorb Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing. That's a hard line that stays militarized. Second, the South China Sea disputes. The territorial claims stay contested and volatile. Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, they're locked into Chinese economic webs but won't cede their islands. So Beijing maintains military pressure in one hand and economic integration in the other, and the conflict freezes but never resolves. The deepest limit is China's own growth. The entire system depends on Beijing having capital to deploy and resources to import. The moment Chinese growth stalls or capital becomes scarce, the tributary nations become desperate to break free or to find rival patrons. Russia tried this in 2022 when it invaded Ukraine. It assumed its neighbors depended on it enough to stay aligned. They didn't. The same risk exists for Beijing. Growth is the glue. If the glue dries up, the system fractures. The system is elegant because it requires no conquest, just continuous dominance. The risk is that dominance is harder to sustain than it looks. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe. I'm David. See you tomorrow.